Calvin's thinking is far more complicated and far more interesting than sometimes even scholars allow it to be.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bomberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here today with David Taylor. He's the author of the new book, Theater of God's Glory, Calvin, Creation, and the Liturgical Arts. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Now, John Calvin is pretty well known for his attitude towards arts in the church, I think, or at least in a superficial way. What do people think of when they think of Calvin and liturgical arts?
I think mostly negative things, I'm afraid to say. But yeah, Calvin, I mean, to be fair to Calvin, in his historical context, there were a lot of very real concerns. I think there were very real practical, liturgical, pastoral, theological concerns that he was facing. He was asking himself, how can I help essentially first and second generation Protestant, Reformational movement people have a full, active, and conscious experience of corporate worship, and felt that for biblical reasons and for reasons with respect to standing Catholic practices, that some significant and substantive changes needed to be made. So as he read Scripture and understood Scripture and certain theological convictions, felt that what the church needed to be doing was to sing with the Psalms. So it was a non-instrumental, so it was a cappella, Psalms, singing practice. Simplicity was a virtue, that it would be articulate, and by that he meant that it was understandable, so that it be in the vernacular, that it be accessible to children and to adults, that they would understand what they were saying, and that there would be a sense in which people were together, so that it wouldn't be somebody singing in Latin and then everybody who doesn't understand Latin is not singing. So a sense that there would be this communion or togetherness through song, through the Psalms in particular. And architectural space was simple, and that's pretty much it. So I want to say positively, I think the redress or the corrective measures in Geneva, I guess you could say, his contexts are worth respecting. I mean, many years later, we can disagree with him, as I do, in some ways, but you don't want to be unfair to him in his own context. You don't want to ask him to be or do things that are not fair to who he was and the kind of person, his position, and the kind of work that he was doing, even though one might say, compared to what the Lutherans were doing, or let's say Martin Luther, or to Martin Butzer, other kinds of contexts in European, or including, maybe say, like what's going on in England, reformational movements, everybody liturgically and artistically is doing different things. And they may be appealing to the same text, but concluding very, very different things. So those are the things that I think are of interest. I think general populations, even sometimes academic populations, have a maybe limited or narrow sense, or just sort of a bumper sticker idea of what Calvin thought. And I think with this book, I'm wanting to say Calvin's thinking is far more complicated and far more interesting than sometimes even scholars allow it to be.
Yeah, he has this reputation for being very negative about the use of really any arts in the church, and that has had considerable ramifications for churches in the Calvinist traditions through the years. And yet in this book, you put his attitude toward liturgical arts up against his theology, especially his theology of creation. And what do you find? Do these line up neatly?
Well, to put it maybe simply or simplistically, Calvin's thinking and writing on the physical creation. This is really my focus, is more the physical creation. So it's not just creation as such, but focusing on the physical aspect of creation. Outside of a liturgical, let's say this is a liturgical context. Outside here, in some cases, it's very effusive. Talks about the affluence, sweetness, and abundance of creation, and that we are permitted to take intense delight in these things. And the gift of wine is a gift that is to be relished and enjoyed and celebrated. And he talks about the inanimate creation, rocks and stars and birds are constantly preaching, constantly at praise, and we are to attend to that. And so there's an aesthetic dimension that we can take delight in. There's a doxological dimension of creation, that creation is constantly both summoning humans to praise and admonishing us in our neglect of a proper, fulsome praise of God. So I find those things so fascinating, and some of that you'll find in the Institutes, which is often where people stop in their investigation of what Calvin might have said. But once you go into his commentaries on Scripture or his sermons or his letters, you find, I'll say this, you find a more humane or a more well-rounded or three-dimensional person, Calvin. And he says very interesting things. He says actually things that one might be surprised. So for example, when Paul says that we're to lift up holy hands, some might interpret that in a purely figurative sense. That it's really
Many do.
yeah. That really what Paul is saying is your heart should be, fully attentive to God. And Calvin actually says, really, sometimes the mind and the heart are lethargic or calcitrant in their attentiveness to God, and the hands and our bodies, this upward movement can instruct the heart and the mind. And so I try to tend to those moments. I don't want to make too much or too little of these, but to at least say there are all these points at which Calvin considers the physical world, so the physical creation, the cosmos as such, physical bodies. And again, he has a reputation, and there's plenty of evidence for why he has a dim view of the physical body. But there are actually many things that he says about the physical body that I think would surprise people by how positive an account he gives, or a positive agency that he gives to the physical body. And especially when he considers Christ's own resurrected, ascended body, and that as a determining theological, or we'll say a determinate theological reading of our physical bodies, or when he considers the physical elements of the body and blood, or the bread and the wine. I think that's what I'm trying to do is to trace, is there a pattern of how he talks about the physical creation? And in many ways, it's surprising to me. I actually didn't set out into this project knowing how it would turn out. Yeah. Actually, I never intended to work with Calvin. I kind of came through the back door, and there he was with astoundingly positive, interesting things about the Eucharist. I thought, wow, that's interesting, so I'll follow the rabbit trail. It took me in all sorts of fascinating places, but I think there's something worthwhile to the scholarly Calvin community, Reformation academic community. I think there's some interesting things for the liturgical world, people that think about worship, and to pastors and artists and folks in the congregation. Yeah. It doesn't mean we agree with everything he says, but I think there's just a far more interesting story to be discovered, and I'm wanting to commend him where I think he's commendable, and to critique him where I think he can be fairly critiqued. So
we know how the story started. How does it end? If you can give us a little spoiler.
Well, in a sense, what I do is, as much as possible, I try to argue in a charitable way Calvin against himself, and to basically say here, let's say, I'm going to say, here's this liturgical space, which has always been for the church a very restrictive space. There are certain things that Christian traditions and communities have felt should happen or should not happen. Fair enough. I have my own convictions. And then beyond this space, the physical world, Calvin has this extraordinary trinitarian instinct. And I think what I try to say is you fail to carry it through, in a sense, to your own logical conclusion. That there's the work of what Irenaeus calls the two hands of God, Christ and the Spirit. And you see Calvin have a very robust Trinitarian frame of mind and mode of argument are out here, and then it just disappears in this space when he talks about it. What I try to do is to say, I think these are plausible reasons why it disappears, but at the end of the day, I say, Calvin, you should have stuck to your theological guns. And again, I don't want to be unfair. I understand why, and there are certain exegetical lines of thought that he takes, and then I retrace those, and then I find myself coming to different exegetical conclusions. And again, in as much of a friendly way as I can, to say, hey, Calvin, I think you should have, held on to your deepest instincts. Yeah. And so at the end, I say, it's fine. Here's why Calvin landed where he did. Fair enough. Here are some things that I think are commendable, certain sensibilities, theological or exegetical or liturgical even. And then I say, obviously, I part ways, and I want to offer something to both the academy and the church, to both scholar, pastor, worship leader, artist, to say, when we think about the arts within a liturgical or a corporate worship context, let's not be satisfied with saying, well, let's do music or architecture or visual arts or whatever else, because there's a textual command, prescript, proscript. That's fine. And let's not stop either at saying, well, let's do this kind of music because it's sacred or transcendent or whatever. Why don't we try to in a sense, be who we are, I guess, as Orthodox Christians, and confess our Trinitarian faith all the way through. And to say, perhaps the physical aesthetic dimension of our worshiping space and the activities have a dynamic movement because Christ himself, by his Spirit, is at work to enable this physical aesthetic data to be caught up, in a sense, really in the doxological movement of all of creation. So all of creation is already at praise because Christ himself, by his Spirit, is enabling it, and then even more so, Christ himself, as the chief liturgist, as Hebrews 2 would remind us, he himself, as the firstborn of creation, is himself gathering up all the aesthetic element or data or dynamism of the cosmos in himself in praise. And so I think what I'd like to offer the reader, whoever he or she may be, is this kind of Trinitarian dynamism that says, actually some really great stuff can happen. And I think I'd like to make as broad of a space for ecclesial and theological location to come into play. So if you are a Mennonite or a Southern Baptist and you have certain convictions, I hope this book can be helpful to you in some ways. I don't need you to agree with me, but what I would love is for you to think more deeply Trinitarian with Calvin and with the tradition I think that he brings, to bear for us as a witness, as a Christian in the 16th century, or if you're a Catholic or Episcopalian or Lutheran or whatever you are, I think Calvin has something rather refreshing, I think practically helpful to the work that we all do when we gather.
What would it look like in real life terms to take this, Trinitarian theology, the aesthetic that's informed by this that Calvin is so enthusiastic about, and bring it into worship and liturgy? What
would that look like?
Yeah.
Practically?
Yeah. Obviously, there are many variations, but what's one possibility?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, one of Calvin's concerns, which is fundamentally legitimate because it is fundamentally a New Testament instinct, a Pauline instinct, is that we be together.
Yeah.
And so his conclusion is singing the Psalms without the distraction of instruments enables us to be together. So when we sing a melody line all together, that is the kind of worship that is not only pleasing to God, but is representative of God's kind of unity. Mm-hmm. So, okay, fair enough. Singing the Psalms, melodic line only, is a way for us to be together. I think what I would like to say is, might not the New Testament itself offer us different models of what togetherness looks like? Now, obviously, church history shows us that the church has had this internal argument of what it means to be together. So, melody only with instruments, a simple instrument, polyphony of all sorts, melody, harmony, multiple instruments, choir, And so I think you can Scripture offers us models of this, and then creation itself, which if we at least consider creation might be the other book, of where God reveals something of the internal life of the triune Godhead, then we would say that perhaps creation can show us various models of what it means for us to be together. So what we could all agree to is that being together is an important virtue. But how that togetherness, Scripture can posit different models of that creation itself, and even as we might make very specific theological arguments or Trinity, what does it mean for the Trinity to be together? That the arts can come along and then give us tastes of our unity that brings a certain fullness of our togetherness, or it even becomes a foretaste of our eschatological togetherness, which we can as yet not fully imagine, but the arts can give us a foretaste of how all kinds of voices and all kinds of bodies and all kinds of spatial relations and instruments and even the visual architectural can bring us into a way of being together that we didn't imagine we could be this unified in this particular way. And then that can, I think, become a bearing of witness to a watching world that wonders, are you people actually united? And the arts can train us or form us in a kind of way of being together that we thought, wow, I thought only singing one melodic line was a way to be together, and then singing 4-part harmony is another way of having this interanimating, interpenetrating sense of our voices are all distinct, but occupying different places in this sonic frequency or the sonic space. But then you put our hands into the mix, and our hands all go up, and all our different shapes of hands, and that's another sign or an insignia, as Calvin might put it, of our togetherness. So all sorts of things I think can be explored or tried on for size, and I don't make terribly too many practical recommendations, but I think it's low-hanging fruit all throughout.
Yeah.
And so I would hope people would feel encouraged and not rebuked.
Yeah, no, there's a wonderful vision that runs through the book for a place for liturgical arts in the church that can bring worship life to new flourishing, new beauty and freedom and peace.
I would hope so. Yeah, even congregations that have a very, let's say, simple aesthetic or artistic apparatus in place. Whitewashed walls, simple pews, hymns only or psalms only. I think in a sense that's great. I would want to commend that, but I would just want to say, think Trinitarianly about what you do, and think about how the kinds of songs you do, how can they be more richly Trinitarian, or how can they enable you to be more richly together or more richly bearing witness to a world. I think there's all this possibility even within an ecclesial liturgical world like that, let alone, an Anglo-Catholic, kind of context, which is, more ornate in some ways. But even then, I would want them to, maybe think through with Calvin, with this book, a more disciplined Trinitarian way of seeing what they do. So that would be my hope, at the very least.
David Taylor, thank you so much for talking with us. It's been a joy.
It's a privilege.
The book again is Theater of God's Glory, Calvin, Creation, and the Liturgical Arts.